Hello everyone, and welcome to Learning Lore. Today we're taking on the first DLC of Black Ops 2 called Revolution that had Highrise as a zombies map, as well as a brand new zombies game mode Turned, which was kind of crazy actually. Because not only was Black Ops 2 the first time we got a new zombies game mode, but it was also the first time we got a second new zombies game mode in the form of a DLC. And I still remember watching the trailer that was released by Call of Duty, seeing the devs talk about their work, and of course Von Dahar, back when he was the game design guy. The hype around this first DLC was massive. But as far as zombies is concerned, for Black Ops 2, I was a little bit disappointed at launch. While I do enjoy Transit quite a bit now, it was sort of a letdown at the time because it was such a big change from what zombies was to me. I mean, it definitely was not Kino der Toten, for sure. And it seems crazy saying this because obviously, I mean, looking at Black Ops 6, we are in like an entirely different dimension when it comes to zombies, and I'm actually enjoying that quite a bit. But either way, I was extremely excited for this DLC and to see what this zombies map had to offer. But of course, back then, I really didn't pay much attention to the zombies storyline. I knew bits and pieces of it from just playing the maps over and over again, but this series, Learning Lore, is meant to change that. So if you're brand new to the zombie storyline and want to learn it alongside me, I welcome you. And if you've been learning it the entire time as every single DLC map came out, doing every single Easter egg, I hope you'll have me. We left off last time on October 21st, 2035, at the end of the events of Transit, and the formation of a brand new crew, Victis. After completing the first polarization device for Maxis, of course, Richtofen wasn't very happy with our characters here. And although it still is sort of unclear why Maxis wants us to charge these polarization devices, it is pretty clear that Richtofen wants control, as he is the one in control of the zombies at this point, and it would make sense that these polarization devices would somehow help him in his reign over the undead. So somehow, someway, I'm not exactly sure, perhaps he used the teleporters that you can find at the lampposts, or he just simply has the ability to say, hey you, I'm teleporting you right now. But either way, he took Victis and teleported them to Province 22, where he demands that Stuhlinger, the only person that can hear his voice, activates the second polarization device. It is important to note that Highrise happens the day after Transit. There is zero downtime between these two maps. So however long, lore-wise, it's meant to take to do the Transit Easter egg, which I don't know, maybe a day, maybe a few hours probably, I would imagine that shortly thereafter finishing that first polarization device, Richtofen teleports them almost immediately, and puts them back to work once again, or at least tries to through Stuhlinger, and convince them to activate this second polarization device. But before we get into the events of Transit and what goes down there when we get teleported, we do have some radios that can be found on the map that, once again, just like Transit, do not pertain to the events of the map itself, and instead actually give us an insight to what was going on before Transit, before Green Run. In those 10 years after those massive missiles hit Earth and fractured the planet. And our very first one is from the CDC director, George Barkley.
Attention all on this channel. This is George Barkley, former assistant director of the CDC facility in Druid Hills, Georgia. Prior to the destruction of our headquarters, our research found evidence that contaminants are now infecting the very air we breathe. As such, exposure of some sort appears inevitable for all survivors. Symptoms are variable, but most subjects display short-term memory loss, psychosis, delusion, and paranoia. Short-term memory loss has also been reported, but as of yet, I have been unable to confirm this. We advise all individuals to monitor their fellow survivors for signs of the above symptoms, paranoia in particular. Ask yourself, are those closest to you really who you think they are? Are they following their own secret agenda? Are they perhaps plotting against you? The dangers presented by such symptoms cannot be overstated. It was with deep sadness that I myself was forced to euthanize 14 members of my own team. My condolences to their families. I hope this message serves as a warning to all survivors. We must all do whatever it takes to ensure our future as a species. Thank you.
This director of the CDC is broadcasting across America, and perhaps the entire world, probably, and stating that these contaminants have now gone airborne. And just as a quick recap, it was back on October 13th, 2025, when the events of Nuketown as well as Moon took place at the same exact time, and those missiles that were shot from the moon at the end of the Easter egg hit Earth, fracturing it, nearly causing the end of humanity. And according to the Chronorium, it was March 18th, 2027 when this distress call happened. Which it's sort of strange that it took 2 years for this research to happen and this distress call from the CDC to start broadcasting across whatever wavelengths. But then again, I would imagine the United States government, as well as the CDC and all of those organizations, were in complete turmoil after suffering massive losses of life and zombies as well, roaming the Earth. But now, these infectious contaminants have gone airborne, and those contaminants being 115. And as we have discussed before, and also that George Barkley here said in his broadcast, the common symptoms are short-term memory loss, psychosis, delusion, and paranoia. And the last of those, it seems that our CDC director here is suffering from. Because he says, paranoia in particular. Ask yourself, are those closest to you really who you think they are? Are they following some secret agenda? He sounds extremely paranoid. In fact, so paranoid that he was forced to euthanize 14 members of his own team. I think he might have gone crazy at this point. Although it is possible that 14 members of his team have just started to turn into zombies, I think it's more likely that he himself, as well as everyone at the CDC, is starting to suffer from these symptoms. And this is sort of hinting at the end of humanity being on the horizon. But Highrise, of course, happens 8 years later. And although there isn't really any sign of life in Highrise, so I suppose all of humanity could be wiped out at that point, we do have one more radio message from the CDC that might give us just a little bit more hope.
For anyone listening, we have food, water, and medical supplies, enough to last several years.
This is another short, but actually quite interesting transmission from George Barkley, the same CDC director we just heard a second ago, and he says to anyone listening, we have food, water, and medical supplies, enough to last several years. Meaning that the CDC could theoretically still be alive in 2035, although if we listen to the tone of his voice, he sounds quite distraught. I'm just going to play a snippet of the first one again so you can tell the difference.
Attention all on this channel. This is George Barkley, former assistant director of the CDC facility in Druid Hills, Georgia.
And then here is the new one.
For anyone listening, we have food, water, and medical supplies, enough to last several years.
In this second broadcast, it sounds like he's almost pleading. Like they need some sort of help, perhaps? They need some people to come to them? Because I would imagine in an apocalypse, it's not a really good idea to broadcast that you have tons of food and water and medical supplies. Because you would think that would invite a lot of people to come and try and rob you and kill you for your food. It could very well be the case that the CDC is suffering quite a bit. And it would make a lot of sense that they'd have a hard time not getting contaminated by 115 and becoming zombies themselves. And listening to George Barkley's voice, and not to mention the first transmission where he sounded super paranoid, he is suffering from some severe 115 exposure, and I don't think he's gonna last too long. So I think the CDC has an end date here, and I have a feeling it's before Highrise happened. Although we don't really have any evidence of that yet, but we do have a little bit more information in this next radio about the events directly after those nukes hit Earth.
Redcon 5, this is Saber 10. Our sweep failed to find any evidence of survivors on site. Broken Arrow is not viable for new FOB. That's a negative, sir. Records appear to have been destroyed in a fire prior to the facility being overrun. Sir, we believe staff may have been trying to destroy evidence implicating them in the outbreak. Understood, sir. Confirmed drop in T-5. Retreating to safe distance.
In this transmission, we hear some Saber 10, most likely a pilot in the Air Force, talking to Recon 5. He says that their sweep has failed to find any evidence of survivors on site, and that Broken Arrow is not viable for a new FOB. Broken Arrow, as we learned in the last episode of Learning Lore, is a United States secret organization. Very much so like the 935 for Germany. This is the organization that has been experimenting with 115 and creating teleporters such as the one at Groom Lake, in Area 51 that teleported us to the moon. And they also created things like the Denizens, for instance, as well as the Avogadro that we released in transit, and then used him for the Maxis side of the Easter egg, which is canon. So I'm not sure where that guy is actually right now. But nevertheless, after these nukes hit Earth, one of them directly hitting Nuketown itself, one of the main bases of operation of Broken Arrow, it seems that there really isn't any survivors. Although, obviously, we do know Russman, someone who we're playing as here in the Victis crew, is from the Broken Arrow organization. I imagine he's one of the very few people still alive. And here we have this pilot saying that Broken Arrow is not viable for a new FOB, which most likely means after those nukes hit Earth, research stopped completely. There's no more experimenting with 115, no more weapons development, no more teleportation technology being created. This is indeed the beginning of the end. And although we can't hear what Recon 5 is saying to this pilot, they do seem to be having a bit of a dialogue here. And after most likely being asked if there's any information to how this happened to Broken Arrow, this Saber 10 says that's a negative, sir. Records appear to have been destroyed in a fire prior to the facility being overrun, meaning that the Broken Arrow employees were trying to cover up what they were doing. And they somehow knew that the facility was going to be overrun, because why else would they be destroying records in a fire if they didn't think that those records might get out somehow? And then the next line from Saber 10 is, "Sir, we believe that the staff may have been trying to destroy the evidence, implicating them in the outbreak." So Broken Arrow is the reason that the zombies broke out. Although, where and when is kind of the question here. So at this point, if we look at the chronorium, it says that this transmission happened on November 5th, 2025. Just about a month after the events of Moon and Nuketown. And I don't think that Nuketown is a primary facility. I mean, after all, it was a facade meant to be exploded by a nuclear device for testing. So I'm thinking that this is the Groom Lake facility that they're talking about here. First starting up that Area 51 sequence and the zombies starting to run at you, there's definitely an outbreak, and it seems like there might have been a fire, at least in some capacity. But as to why Broken Arrow would purposefully release zombies and create this outbreak, I have absolutely no idea. Maybe Richtofen somehow had a role in this because obviously he wanted to go to Moon to be able to interact with the MPD, and he somehow convinced people working at the Broken Arrow facility to not only cause this outbreak, but also tune the teleporter so that he could be teleported to Moon. If it wasn't already linked to do so, which it very well might be the case that that's exactly why the teleporter was created in the first place, so I'm not entirely sure about that part. In fact, I'm very much so not sure at all why this outbreak happened at Groom Lake. Originally, I thought it was just Samantha trying to stop this crew from getting to the Moon, which would make the most sense to me considering she was in control of the zombies at that point. But this radio from Saber 10 seems to paint a different picture, like the staff there at Broken Arrow are the reason that that outbreak happened. Or perhaps their negligence is. I'm not entirely sure. But there is a third possibility, I suppose. Perhaps through some kind of process, the people of Broken Arrow knew that Samantha was about to unleash zombies upon the base. The outbreak might have started a bit slower, perhaps, and in the turmoil, the people who were still alive on the base started burning documents. But at the same time, it really doesn't make sense why you would burn documents at your own secret base, unless you didn't want your own government knowing what you were doing. Perhaps there was some research there at Groom Lake that the Pentagon didn't know about, at least officially. But either way, at the end of this radio transmission, we hear Saber 10 said, "Understood, sir," after receiving some sort of command, and he states, "Confirmed drop in T-5, retreating to a safe distance." It seems to be the case that the Groom Lake facility has been nuked by the United States, and there is no longer any Area 51 to go back to. So we have now fully answered the question to what has happened to Broken Arrow. It seems they're pretty much done for. Although the United States seems to have some sort of capacity still, obviously the military is still operating, dropping nukes on Area 51, for instance. And the CDC is broadcasting, although it seems like that is sort of running up on its expiration date, and a lot of people seem to be dying from this contamination that is now in the air. But one thing that we haven't touched yet is just the normal everyday civilians that are out there trying to survive in the apocalypse. And of course, in the last episode of Learning Lore, we learned that there are two main factions sort of floating about in the US. One of them being the Flesh, the people who are eating zombies to survive and are able to hear Richtofen's voice in their head, since he is in control of the zombies and he has some sort of tether to those that are eating the undead flesh. And then there is the second group of people, the ones who are sort of listening to what Maxis has to say, as he's broadcasting through all electronical equipment, and can most likely reach a lot larger audience as well. And although I'm not entirely sure which group this next person belongs to, let's have a listen and we'll discuss what we can learn from it.
If there's anyone out there, please respond. I desperately need help. The others left me, and I'm alone and frightened. Help! I tried to do it right, but the others, they wouldn't listen. This piece goes here. This piece goes there. I couldn't do it on my own. I need help. I really do. The German man stopped talking to me, and I don't know what to do. What to do.
In this radio transmission, we hear some woman that is quite distraught, and once again, fantastic voice acting. But we hear she is most likely trying to complete one of these polarization devices. This whole piece goes here and piece goes there nonsense, but she couldn't do it on her own, and she needs help, but the others have left her and wouldn't participate. And she says that the German man has stopped talking to her, and she doesn't know what to do. And like I said, I'm not entirely sure which group this lady belongs to, although I'm sort of leaning on the side that this has something to do with the flesh. And she has eaten the undead, and that German man is Richtofen. Although, obviously, both Maxis and Richtofen are German, so it doesn't really tell us who this is. But with others not listening to her, it would sort of make sense that this is Richtofen that she's hearing, and the other people aren't hearing Richtofen, so they're like, this crazy lady, we just need to leave her alone and move on, right? She's clearly infected with 115, so let's go away from here. And she was just left there trying to build this device for a voice in her head. But somewhere along the way, the German man stopped talking to her. And I'm not entirely sure why that would be. Perhaps she hasn't eaten flesh in a while, and you need to continuously eat the flesh to be able to hear Richtofen, or at least hear him well. Or maybe there's something else going on with Richtofen entirely that we'll learn here in a bit. But either way, it seems that she has lost communication and is left without any guidance at all. We don't know what happens to that lady, but we do have one more radio transmission from Highrise, and this one is definitely from a member of the Flesh.
Science has failed us. He has abandoned us. In this new world, we alone are your salvation. We alone can light the way. Hear our words. Heed our call. There is but one path to enlightenment. Just as they would consume us, we must consume them. We are the living, and we are the dead. We are the flesh, and the flesh is us. We will not starve. We will thrive.
In this broadcast, we hear what sounds like an advertisement to those who can hear it to join the Flesh and begin eating the undead, to heed our words, heed our call, and that there is one path to enlightenment. According to the Chronorium, this transmission happened on April 4th, 2028, which is now almost 3 years after those nukes hit Earth, but still a whole 7 years from the events of Highrise and Transit. And this transmission doesn't really tell us all that much, although it is really cool to hear what's going on with just the normal, everyday people. It reminds me a lot of The Walking Dead, actually, weirdly enough, where there's these different factions that are forming. It was a really cool storyline back in Black Ops 2. And I remember playing back in the day, hearing a couple of these transmissions, and being like, oh my god, what's going on here? It's just awesome to put it all together. It seems that the Flesh are definitely not starving, and that they're thriving, at least as much as they can. Because I would imagine eating the undead flesh, eventually that 115 exposure would drive you to either go completely insane, or slowly kill you over time. But finally, it's time to talk about Highrise itself. So skipping forward a bit from these transmissions, we're now in 2035, at the setting of Highrise. Of course, we know who we're playing as. It's Victis, and we're being teleported directly from Transit by Richtofen. And the when is pretty simple as well. I've already stated it. October 22nd, 2035, the day after the events of Transit. The where, however, is a little bit interesting. I suppose it's quite obvious when playing the map that you're somewhere in China. But the very first thing you see when loading up a match of Highrise is the Great Leap Forward. And perhaps this will give us a little bit of an insight on what the developers were thinking with Highrise, because up to this point we haven't heard anything about China, like at all. There hasn't been a single mention about a research organization in China, and although some might think, well, isn't China with Russia, don't they have some sort of relationship? And it could very well be the case, but during the Cold War this definitely wasn't. And in fact, in the Black Ops 2 campaign, the same can be said. As if you don't do one of those Strike Force missions that they have in that game, those optional ones that are on the multiplayer maps, China will invade Russia, believe it or not, as part of the Black Ops 2 storyline, which is kind of wild. So I don't think the relationship is all that close here for Black Ops 2, and I imagine that that applies to the zombies storyline as well, although I don't know for sure. But nevertheless, it doesn't seem like China has all that much 115 technology. They probably don't have teleporters, I don't think they have all that much 115 weaponry, but perhaps with just being able to find some 115 and reverse engineering some things, they've probably made some things of their own that we'll find out soon. But before we do, let's look into this Great Leap Forward first. The Great Leap Forward was a real historic event in China. It was an economic and social campaign that happened from 1958 to 1962, led by the party chairman, Mao Zedong. This campaign led to massive famine in China, with millions of people dying during the Great Leap. And now this is marked as the Great Chinese Famine, and is the second largest famine in human history. During this time, there was a mandatory agriculture collectivization, meaning that private farming was prohibited, and those who engaged in it were persecuted and labeled counter-revolutionaries, which is crazy to think that just making some food out in the garden behind your house was completely illegal. And this, of course, is what led to this massive famine. But considering the events of Highrise happened in 2035, right around 80 years after the actual Great Leap Forward, I'm not entirely sure what this has to do with the map. In the Black Ops 2 storyline, there's this thing called the Strategic Defense Coalition, and this coalition is led by China. And although this coalition is mainly just for the campaign of Black Ops 2, we do see its soldiers used for zombies on Highrise. In fact, they're the very first armored zombies, extremely common now in Black Ops 6. But here it was, back in Black Ops 2. But nevertheless, this coalition is an East Asian, Chinese-led strategic military alliance, much like NATO is for the Western countries. And it would make a lot of sense that this SDC, not only having military capacity, also probably has some sort of research going on with 115. They're most likely developing some kind of weaponry, although I don't think they have the reach that, for instance, the Ascension program had for the USSR. Although, as I stated before, one of the possibilities in the Black Ops 2 campaign is this SDC invading Russia and making them join the coalition. And if that happened, I would imagine that China would have access to all of the research that Russia has been doing to that point, or at least a significant portion of it. And perhaps this sort of paints a better picture of what China has been doing this entire time, as we literally haven't heard a single thing from them. They are definitely the latest to the game in 115. As we've learned so far, Germany was first back in World War II, and America sort of started developing alongside them, although a little bit later and with a lot less information. And then after the end of World War II, Russia and the United States split up all the resources of Germany, and thus began this sort of 115 weapons race in the Cold War. That entire time, China most likely was not doing any research whatsoever. Maybe they knew what 115 was, I'm not entirely sure. But at some point down the line, much further into the future, China most likely started research on its own, as it began developing as a military power, after the whole Great Leap Forward thing ended, and after China had its own industrial revolution. Well, on the map Highrise, of course, there is quite a bit of evidence they've done at least some stuff with 115, as there is a brand new enemy type that we haven't seen before on any other maps, and we will never see again, as well as a wonder weapon, which is very strange, actually. First, let's start with the jumping jacks, which do look a lot like the Nova Crawlers from Black Ops 1. Except instead of just crawling on the ground and releasing Nova 6 when you kill them, they jump on the walls and the ceilings and make it really hard to shoot them. In fact, hard enough that if you kill them all with 100% accuracy, you get rewarded a free perk. A pretty damn good reward, actually, for a max ammo round. And they also seem to have some sort of electric power. as they can electrocute the player, and they also are able to teleport. Although only over short distances, it seems. So immediately this makes me quite unsure of their origin. I don't know if 115 is necessarily needed for these types of experiments. I've sort of assumed so in the past. It would make a lot of sense, as 115 is sort of the way that we explain a whole lot of stuff going on in zombies that doesn't really make sense in real life. But it seems that China took a human and combined it with like a frog or something, as they have this unique jumping ability, and if you listen to the sounds of them, I mean, they kind of sound like a frog jumping around. And then not only this, they also infuse this frog human with some electricity, and it gives it the ability to teleport over short distances, which this part definitely sounds like some kind of 115 stuff going on. But that is sort of strange, because there is no teleporter on Highrise, and there's no evidence that China had been working on a teleporter, or even really had access to that kind of technology. So why would they make these really strange-looking creatures teleport? It doesn't make sense to me. I suppose it's possible that this was the beginning of their teleportation testing, and it was done with these strange creatures that they were working on, instead of humans, I suppose, as the Germans were doing back in World War II. I suppose that could be a very plausible explanation, but I'm still sort of unsure, so let me know down in the comment section if you guys have any extra info on the Chinese teleportation technology in the zombie storyline. I'd love to hear about it. But now let's address the Sliquifier. The Sliquifier is the wonder weapon on Highrise, and just like the jet gun in transit, can be built by collecting a bunch of parts and bring them over to a crafting table. But unlike the jet gun, it does actually count as a weapon instead of just an equipment slot, and it is obtainable from the mystery box. And although the main function in game is to make things slippery, I don't think that's the main function of this weapon. I'm assuming the main thing that China was developing here was the liquid itself, which it seems like when it comes in contact with organic matter, it dissolves it and makes this slippery goo. And perhaps this weapon, the Sliquifier, was simply just a means to test it. Because I would imagine a liquid like this would be very useful if you could, for instance, just drop it from a plane. Instead of shooting it out of some device at a close range, it doesn't seem to work as well, at least in like a military context. But I suppose it could be pretty good at killing zombies, as it doesn't seem to eat through like concrete or anything else on the map, right? It only eats through the organic matter. And I suppose, specifically undead organic matter. Because as the player, when you walk on it, it doesn't damage you. I mean, you're sure as hell slip, but it doesn't hurt you. So perhaps the liquid is engineered such that it only kills the undead. And if that's the case, then we can definitely have a good idea of what it's used for. China was getting ready to be able to take care of these outbreaks. But unfortunately, by the looks of Highrise, I don't think they got there in time. And before we wrap up this background on China, there is one more thing I want to say, and that's this whole Province 22 thing. On the wiki, it says that Highrise takes place on Shanghai collided with Province 22. And when we access this Province 22, it brings us to this wiki, the Jilin Province, which looks to be quite a bit further north than Shanghai. So if this is the 22nd province and supposed to be where Highrise takes place, I'm not entirely sure how it's supposed to have collided with Shanghai, and what Shanghai has to do with this province, I don't understand. Maybe some temporal rift stuff happened here? Although, something to note that's very important to the location of Highrise is this building just outside the map is a real building from Shanghai. If we head on over to Google Maps and zoom into Shanghai, we can see this Jinmao Tower, which, looking at the pictures, is very much so that same exact building. It has the same sort of spire on top of it that we see in-game, and the overall shape of it is pretty much identical. The only difference, of course, is here on Highrise, the building is partially destroyed, seemingly after being hit by a meteorite or something of that nature. And the weird part about this, it seems that Treyarch made this building in two pieces. The part that we're looking at right now, and then the top portion that sort of makes this building noticeable is what it is. And that's because there is an identical version of this building outside the map over here as well. It seems to be the exact same model used, except with some more billboards added on top of it, and that top portion with the spire leading up isn't there. I don't know if there is any meaning to this because there doesn't seem to be two of these in the actual Shanghai, but I suppose the biggest point to take away is this building is definitely from Shanghai. Although, there isn't really any other landmarks to speak of. I mean, the weirdest part to me is Treyarch didn't seem to include this structure, which looks very zombies to me. Perhaps it was just too difficult to make, and they didn't end up doing that, because it's a very custom building, and it really couldn't be used for much else probably in the game. But this thing just screams zombies to me, man, and they, for some reason, didn't put this in. So maybe that could be used as evidence why the Jinhao Tower is here, and perhaps we're not actually in Shanghai. We're in Shanghai that has been teleported to Province 22, which is much further north. Or, and this is a pretty wild theory, perhaps we're actually floating. Now, this one I don't think is actually the case, but if we go underneath the map, of course, there is no ground. We are simply a bunch of buildings above a cloud layer, essentially. And it seems that we're much higher up than it would appear, at least in real life. And above us, it feels like we're getting a peek out of the atmosphere. It almost looks like we're pretty close to those chunks of Earth that are floating above us. I mean, some of them are larger than the moon itself. And of course, after those missiles hit Earth, massive pieces of the Earth came off of it and began orbiting its center of mass. Could it be that Shanghai is just a piece of Earth floating out there near the end of the atmosphere? I sort of doubt it, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it's kind of cool. I would imagine this is probably the least likely theory, but nevertheless, we're definitely in Shanghai somehow. But finally, it's time for the events of Die Rise.
I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Why me? Travel where? Don't you get it? There's nothing left. Oh, how did you... What? What do you mean, mend the rift? Well, maybe I don't wanna. Huh? Did you think of that? Oh, you can't tell them about the flesh. What I did, they'd kill me if they knew. Ah, shit!
If you're gonna talk to your imaginary friends, Stu, you might want to wait till you're in a Z-free zone.
Stupider! Get over here, now! Come on, come on!
What do we do now?
We arm up, find a good place to defend, kick ass, that's it!
I don't understand.
What are you talking about, Stuhlinger? Misty made it pretty clear.
Accept your fate. Begin anew.
We're going down! We're going down! Fight!
Have we been here before?
And immediately when starting up a match of Die Rise, we get a cutscene. What I think is the second cutscene of zombies, the first of course being from 5, and the second one here being in Black Ops 2, starting a tradition actually, as all of the rest of the maps in Black Ops 2 will have one as well. A great tradition, by the way, Treyarch, thank you for that one. But it does bring about a whole bunch of questions. So first of all, we see them teleported from the United States to Die Rise as this sort of monologue, although it is, I guess, a dialogue between Stuhlinger and Richtofen, but we can't really hear Richtofen very much. Either way, we hear Stuhlinger talking to Richtofen, and it seems that he's telling him to close the rift, as if that is his goal for Victis to complete. Which we have heard about rifts before at this point, in fact leading all the way back to the first Learning Lore episode. But it seems like Richtofen here is talking about a specific rift. It's like the rift, you know? Not like just one here around Die Rise, but perhaps a much larger one that is causing some trouble here on Earth after those missiles made impact. I'm not entirely sure what this rift is, and perhaps we'll learn more about it soon, but we can also hear Stuhlinger pleading with him not to tell the other members that he has eaten zombies, and that he was a member of the Flesh. Which on its own kind of seems a bit strange that these members wouldn't know that by now. I mean, I kind of assume that they do. I mean, he's talking to a voice in his head. And considering it's been 10 years since 2025 when those nukes hit Earth and people started eating the zombies, I would take a good guess that they've come to the conclusion that those who talk to a voice in their head were at one point eating undead zombies and perhaps members of the Flesh. But nevertheless, after being teleported there while Stuhlinger is talking to Richtofen, we see Russman save him from a horde of zombies in what looks like this spawn room, actually, for Die Rise, which is kind of cool. But shortly thereafter, Russman dies. He's eaten by zombies and is definitely killed in this cutscene. Stuhlinger runs over to the others inside of the elevator, and they take it down to another floor where they're trapped by zombies. Surrounded on all sides, they're being overrun, and we hear the voice of Richtofen once again, accept your fate, begin anew. Right before our Victis cast is killed, and the whole thing starts over again at the beginning of Highrise. So one thing we know for sure is that Highrise is a time loop. And I'm guessing it's controlled by Richtofen, considering he knew that this time loop was happening and told them to begin anew. And he's also the one who teleported them to the other side of the world, so yeah, it'd make a lot of sense that he's the one in control of it. So I guess the Victis cast cannot fail at Highrise. No matter what, they'll definitely get this polarization device completed. Which we're gonna have to get into that a little bit more later when we start doing the Easter egg here. But no matter what, when Victis dies, they do respawn right here in the spawn room, which I guess is just like a normal game of zombies for everyone else. But it's kind of crazy to see that happen in the actual storyline of zombies, because up until now, I don't think this has been the case, although maybe for Transit. Because that was a lot to do in one day and actually figure out in one day, considering that there has been a whole lot of people before that trying to create this polarization device for Maxis, and some trying to create it for Richtofen, and all of them failing. But then Victis comes along and then just completes it probably in a few hours and is teleported to China. So perhaps in Transit as well, they were in this time loop. And every time they died, they spawned back at the bus depot. And that would make sense with the Chronorium, because if we look closely, and as I stated in the last episode of Learning Lore, Stuhlinger and Russman run into Marlton and Abigail at the diner near the Hanford site facility, not the bus depot. So the first time that they met was at the diner down the road, which was the first stop, funny enough, from the bus depot. And after meeting, I'm guessing they died shortly thereafter, and the time loop started back at the bus depot with all four of them together. A power to turn on, and Maxis talking to them through electronics along their way. But I'm not exactly sure if this is the case though, so let me know down in the comment section if you guys do. It seems to make sense to me that Transit would have been a time loop, and also Highrise here being the same. But nevertheless, it is definitely a crazy revelation to find out that that is the case. But now it's time to do an Easter egg, and this one is called High Maintenance. And as the wiki says, this Easter egg requires the player to be the architect of their instruction. And just like Transit, we have two versions of the Easter egg, one for Maxis and another one for Richtofen. Immediately when arriving at Highrise, the first thing we see, other than zombies I suppose coming through the windows, is a desk in front of us, and on it are some electronics that begin talking to us once again. It's Maxis telling us that we will hear him, and we should listen.
The energy fields are no longer disrupting my communications via electrical devices. You will hear me, and you should listen.
Which I imagine is exactly what Victis does. And it would make a lot of sense that that's why the Maxis side of the storyline is canon. But before we start the Easter egg here, I'm gonna take a sip of the coffee. Because, of course, I have my coffee with me here this morning, and I hope wherever you are, whatever time you're watching this, you're enjoying yourself. Because learning the lore of Black Ops 2 has been a fantastic experience so far. It's really crazy just how much I didn't know back in the day. So genuinely, thank you all for making this possible, because I don't think I'd be doing it if it wasn't for this channel. And with that being said, there are some other people we need to thank. The first of which are the makers of the Chronorium, who are this list of people right here, who put in their time and effort to make this little interactive book, which makes learning the zombies storyline so much better. And on top of that, we're also using Black Ops 2 Reimagined, which allows us to do the Highrise Easter egg solo. So another thank you to Jay Bleezy for creating this awesome mod, which has a ton of features in it as well. Quality of life improvements as well as some extra game modes, which is really cool. So thank you once again to all of these awesome people for making this series possible. Links are down in the description for both the Chronorium as well as the Black Ops 2 Reimagined mod. But without further ado, let's get into the first step of the Easter egg. The first thing we need to do here on Highrise is turn on the power. So I suppose let's do that real quick.
Power's on. Just don't touch any bare wires.
Beautiful. And the reason we need to do this is to access the elevators. 4 of these elevators have a golden symbol on them, while there's also other ones, such as this one right here, that don't. There's one here on the Bowie Knife elevator, another one back here on Quick Revive, as well as the elevator that is right here next to it. And then finally another one by the Remington 870. Normally these 4 symbols have to be stood on at the same time by 4 different players in a match. But of course, we got Black Ops 2 Reimagined, and it makes it doable in solo. Nevertheless, after doing so, we hear Maxis talking to us once again through the electronics, saying the alignment has begun, and you're on the right path.
The alignment has begun. You are on the right path. Please, continue.
I don't exactly know how these symbols are aligning the polarization device, but it seems that they are. And I suppose it would make some sort of sense since these elevators are what the perks are inside of. So I suppose for China, these held some sort of significance. Now for this next step, there are symbols on the floor, each one of them needing to be activated in a certain order. This order is normally completely random, and the only way to actually figure it out is by trial and error. Trial and error unless you're playing as Stuhlinger, who can hear Richtofen in his head, and apparently, Richtofen knows the order, because he will count it out as you step on the symbols, counting in German with each successful step.
1, 2, 3, 4. Good work, Samuel.
And if you fail it, you'll hear this voice line from Maxis.
You must trigger the symbols in the correct order. An order that only trial and error will reveal.
But finally, when doing it correctly, you'll hear this.
Excellent. The energy fields are changing, transforming, flowing. You are on the right path.
And it seems we are indeed on the right path for both Maxis and Richtofen at this point, because these first steps of the Easter egg are actually for both quests. And something that's quite interesting about these symbols, the part that lights up is actually stored just beneath them. It's a separate texture from the one that's above it, and the one above is simply just replaced with this one that's down below. So the symbol isn't actually lighting up after all, it's just being replaced with a different texture. And right after Maxis has this line about the energy fields changing and transforming, he gives you another one, saying that we need to look for objects of steel and an appropriate weapon to manipulate some energy fields.
You must look for objects of steel. With the appropriate weapon, their energy fields can be manipulated.
And I know I definitely did this Easter egg back in the day, but it was with someone who knew the steps much better than me. Most likely watched a Mr. Waffles video or something, but for this next step, we need a sniper rifle, and I really don't remember that being the case. Kinda wild, actually, considering it's extremely fundamental here, as it's on the 3rd step of the Easter egg. I guess that's why they put the SVU down here, and I somehow never realized it. But after purchasing it, we will hear another voice line.
You will need the weapon you hold in due time. Ensure you guard it with your knife.
And we'll hear a very similar one from Richtofen if we're playing as Stuhlinger.
We must neutralize any errant energy fields in order to prevent Maxis from enacting his plan. Take whatever action is necessary to ensure the sources do not fall under his control. If you can find them!
And this is where we need to choose a side. Since it is the canon, we'll start with the Maxis side of the Easter egg, as that will set our foot forward down the storyline of zombies, and then after that, we'll go back as Stuhlinger and do the Richtofen side. For this next step of the Easter egg, we need to shoot these little balls here inside of the dragon's mouths. And it seems that there's definitely one here floating in each of them, and we need the sniper rifle in order to do so. So, here's our first one.
It is working! The sphere has relocated. Now, one more must be found.
And here's the second.
The energy within the spheres is in flux. Fear not, we will need them in due course. Now, find the enlightened one. A blood sacrifice alone is not enough.
And after completing this step of the Easter egg, we have had 4 quotes from Maxis. One of them telling us that it's working after shooting the first ball, and a second one saying that the energy within the spheres is in flux, so I suppose these spheres hold some sort of energy. Most likely 115 of origin, or perhaps even like Vril, actually. As with just like Shangri-La, I mean, they kind of feel a lot like that map, and like the summoning key, for instance, so perhaps this has something to do with them. And finally, we have 2 more quotes. One that says we need to find an enlightened one, and that a blood sacrifice alone is not enough. And a final one saying that reincarnation is key.
Reincarnation is key.
So we need an enlightened one, some special person or zombie perhaps, and a blood sacrifice, a killing I suppose of the zombie, is not enough. and that reincarnation is the key to this step of the Easter egg. For this next step of the Easter egg, we need to kill zombies on the ground floor of the Buddha room. And when doing so, we'll start to hear some more quotes from Maxis that seem to hint we're doing the right thing.
Yes, keep going! More blood!
So I suppose the enlightened one is Buddha, and that's really just supposed to be a hint that we need to be in this room. And the reincarnation part, well, of course, that is part of the teachings of Buddhism. But there is more importance to this quote, and we'll get to that in just the next step. The part that I find kind of weird about this is that he did say a blood sacrifice is not enough, but yet we're definitely doing a blood sacrifice here. I mean, we're killing zombies. I guess it's an undead blood sacrifice, perhaps. But still, it's kind of the same thing, right? I guess maybe that voice line is sort of hinting that we need to be in a specific place, perhaps? But most sacrifices happen in a specific place, so I'm really not entirely sure. But after killing enough zombies in the Buddha room, we hear this quote from Maxis.
Reincarnation will reveal the way forward.
Saying that reincarnation will reveal the way forward. And the ballistic knife, when you upgrade it, revives players when they're down, so I guess we need to use that now in the Buddha room. And sure enough, that is the next step of the Easter egg, to get the ballistic knife from the mystery box and pack-a-punch it to the cross refibrillator. And after doing so, we do hear another quote from Maxis.
The regenerative powers of that device are vital to our success. Ensure you do not lose it.
Hinting again that we definitely need the ballistic knife. And after going back to the Buddha room and firing the ballistic knife, we hear two more quotes from Maxis.
Ah, yes! Do you see? The energy of their broken souls has been released!
One saying that the energy of the broken souls, I imagine the 15 zombies that we just killed is what they're talking about, have been released by shooting this ballistic knife that is charged with 115 and revives enemies, so I guess here it's taking the souls, and I guess storing it in those balls that we just shot out of the dragon's mouths, so that we can then use them to charge the polarization device. Ah, it's very convoluted, but I guess it wouldn't be a zombies Easter egg without that, huh?
The energy fields remain in flux. Matter must be transformed before it can be contained.
And we get a second quote here saying that the energy fields must remain in flux, and that the matter should be transformed before it can be contained. And finally, there is also a third quote from Maxis.
The spire must be energized with fire and light. Create a field with which to bind it.
Saying that the spire must be energized with fire and light, and that we have to create a field with which to bind it. This is our next step of the Easter egg. Now the balls are charged with the souls of those zombies, and we need to create a field to energize the spire. And in order to create this field, we need the trample steam, which can be built, of course, underneath the spawn room. And here on Black Ops 2 Reimagined, it seems like it cost 1,000 points. Nice. But I suppose it's time to go ahead and place our trample steams and grab our balls here from the lion statue. Each of these balls needs to be placed on a trample steam and then shot across to the roof on the other side, where there is also supposed to be another trample steam, but thankfully with Black Ops 2 Reimagined, I don't have to worry about that, as that would make this not possible to do in solo. But normally the balls are launched a second time, and I believe it is at the polarization device itself. And when this happens, their energy, I suppose, combines with this device and completes this step of the Easter egg. The places we need to put these trample steams are marked by this little lion statue, which makes a lot of sense considering that's where the balls come from. There's the one that we did already, as well as this one right here, right at the bottom of the escalator. After placing our second ball and launching it across to the other building, we get another voice line from Maxis, and the polarization device starts to glow.
Form a stand, charge in hand. Only then will the spire be ours.
We hear that we need to form a stand with charge in hand, and only then the spire will be ours. Well, the charge in hand part of this is the part that's useful for the Easter egg, although I guess maybe forming a stand is too, in a way. But nevertheless, the charge in hand that we're talking about here is the Gavin Knuckles. In order to complete this step of the Easter egg, we need to punch this tower in a specific order. An order that is determined by these Mahjong tiles that I really don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In fact, I doubt I am. But each one of these tiles corresponds to a direction: south, north, west, and east. But in total, there are 8 tiles that can be found. 4 of the tiles are directions, and the other 4 are for the order. And the order of them changes from game to game, which makes this step of the Easter egg a real pain, actually. And since this one is blue, we need to look for the other blue symbol, and that is how we'll know what order to do this in. And here is the blue tile associated with it. This one looks like a bird, which for some reason is the symbol for 1, while the symbols for 2, 3, and 4 are just a bunch of dots. So for our run here, we had the order of north, east, west, and south.
Oh, I appreciate that my efforts have been recognized.
Upon doing this, the tower will charge up. Fire will begin emitting from it and crawling up the tower, as well as electricity, which is just arcing to the ground below it. And of course, we'll get all the perks in the game. Gotta love a good perkaholic Easter egg, eh? And it's really cool to be able to get up close and personal to these effects, because if we look really closely, this fire isn't actually fire. It seems to be a bunch of little red particles. A lot like the particles that we saw on the transit Easter egg. So I'm not sure if these are like souls or something, or perhaps this is just what the developers decided to use to make this effect, but it definitely represents that this polarization device is charged for Maxis to complete whatever goals that he has, which are certainly unclear at this moment. Although, to be fair, a pretty good guess could be had that it has something to do with Samantha, as she is currently stuck on the moon still with Ultimus for the past 10 years. I have no idea what's going on up there, but I imagine they're still alive. I mean, Dempsey, Nikolai, and Takio are pretty good at killing zombies at this point, so I assume that they are. And we will most likely be finding that out pretty soon here in the near future. But that is the Maxis side of the Easter egg. So now it's time for Richtofen. When you hop in a match of Highrise as Stuhlinger, you start to hear some groans towards the beginning of the match. Before turning on the power, this is Richtofen trying to talk to you, but failing to do so, it seems. Like he's being held back by something, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's the first polarization device that's doing it, but I don't really think so, because in the intro cutscene he was talking to Stuhlinger just fine. So I really don't know why this is the case, actually. But after turning on the power, we do hear a quote from him.
It's on now.
Vital energy flows to all things, living or dead. My power to manipulate these forces is fragile and limited. That is why I need your help.
He says to us that his power flows through those that are living or dead, just like he did in Transit, actually, but says that his power to control such things is limited, and that's why he needs our help. Which makes a lot of sense that he can't exactly just make living people do things. But at the same time, he can also teleport people, as well as create some kind of temporal loop that we're in right now. Or at least I think that's him doing it. So he definitely has a lot of power, it's just sort of limited in a strange way. But after shooting the first ball from the dragon's mouth, we have a very strange quote from Richtofen.
Look to the dragon. The energy flows. Oh, how it flows on my face.
Saying that the energy is flowing, and it flows on his face. Yeah, Richtofen's a real nutcase. And then, when shooting the last ball, we have another one, which also is quite strange. But it ends with him telling us that we need a rapid liquefaction, which just happens to be the wonder weapon on the map.
The balls! It's all about the balls! You must purge the energy before Maxis interferes! Perhaps a rapid liquefaction will suffice, yeah? Then do it!
And thankfully the wonder weapon can just be crafted right here underneath the power room. And costs 10,000 points? Oh my god, Black Ops Reimagined, you're not making this easy here for me. And after we get the Sliquifier, we need to go ahead and wet the balls.
Yeah! Make those balls wet, you whore!
Which, yeah, these quotes from Richtofen are wild. But after shooting one of the balls 10 times, we get yet another one.
More! Keep going! Oh, you cannot have triballs, cannot triballs. Oh, not good.
And finally, after hitting one 20 times, the ball starts spinning. And a quote from Maxis can be heard, damning us for not following his instructions.
If you cannot follow my instructions, then you are of no use to me.
And finally, once both balls are spinning, we hear some quotes from Richtofen.
Oh, that was good. Maxis will no longer be able to get his filthy hands on those balls. Those also wet balls. Now, the real fun can begin. The Spire! It needs the energy of the undead! We must find a way to make our blood sacrifice!
The last of which saying that the Spire needs the energy of the undead, and we must find a way to make our blood sacrifice. But what is important to note about this is, at this point, Maxis' plan is completely foiled. He can no longer use those balls, and I imagine that means he can't power the Spire for him. So all of these next steps are not to stop Maxis from powering the Spire, but instead to get the Spire under Richtofen's control. And perhaps to close the rift, or something of that nature. But either way, it seems we need to make a blood sacrifice to continue, which I guess is why Maxis said a blood sacrifice won't suffice, as that's what we need to do for Richtofen, and I guess I just didn't notice that earlier, so don't hate me. But in order to do this, we need zombies and a trample steam. This step is relatively easy. We just have to set up the trample steam a lot like the Maxis side of the Easter egg, except the symbols on the floor, instead of being lions, are zombies, and you have to have a zombie walk over the trample steam. And I imagine what's happening here is the zombies are slamming into the tower, and somehow the souls are being harvested in some kind of way, I suppose, allowing us to charge up the Spire, a lot like the step of the Easter egg for Maxis, where we're killing zombies in the Buddha room, except this time we're flinging them at the tower instead. And the entire time that we're doing this, we're getting quotes from Richtofen that we need to keep going, signaling that we're doing it right.
Oh, look at you! So clever! The machine can automate the undead's destruction. Keep going! More machines are needed. I'm so excited! I'm so pleased. Keep going. I love it when we plan and come together! What were we doing?
And after completing this step of the Easter egg, the Spire will start to glow. Just like it did with Maxis, except this time, it's blue.
Holding back! Holding back! We're so close, we're so close, we're so close. I can feel it! Only with your combined energy can we fully control the tower. You need a conduit for the electrical energy contained within your living flesh. Any ideas? Oh, I know. How about those electric knuckle punchy things?
And just like with the Maxis side of the Easter egg, we need the electric knuckle punchy things, the Gavin knuckles. And the final step is exactly the same as it was before. We need to find the tiles, match them up, and determine the order in which we need to punch the tower. And once again, after completing the steps and hitting the tower in the correct order, it lights up just as it did before with Maxis, except this time in blue. It's, as far as I can tell, the exact same effect, except a different color. Very much so like the transit Easter egg was for the Spire on that map, but this time instead for this radio communication building. And that is the end of the Easter egg for both Maxis as well as Richtofen. It's very clear what Richtofen wants here, not only to stop Maxis, but also to gain complete control. I would imagine if he powered these Spires all for himself, he would be able to have complete control over everything in the universe. And also mend the rift, or perhaps use the rift for his own goals. Perhaps this means he would decide to teleport Maxis into a room and kill him over and over again. I'm not exactly sure, but it makes a lot of sense for Richtofen, because he is definitely the kind of person who gets off on power. As we can tell throughout the Easter egg with his quotes, he's quite excited. And as for Maxis and his goals, we won't fully understand that until a few episodes from now in Learning Lore, specifically when we finish Buried. So stay tuned for that down the line. But before we part, if we take one more trip back to the Chronorium, we can see that on October 22nd, 2035, still hoping to regain control, Richtofen teleported Victis to Province 22, where he demands that Stuhlinger activate the second polarization device. Once again, the crew sides with Maxis, and the voices cease for some time, leaving Victis to wander the Earth. So, after powering this polarization device and aligning it for Maxis, Richtofen goes away. And perhaps this is why that woman was crying in that radio that we played earlier. Maybe this is why Richtofen isn't talking to her anymore. After the second polarization device happens, it seems that he's stopped talking to Stuhlinger as well. But what is definitely the case is 2 polarization devices are now aligned for Maxis. And Richtofen, well, it seems like he has no hope in gaining control. And now that Victis' work here is done at Highrise, I'm not entirely sure where they're going from here. The Chronorium says that they're left to wander the Earth, but I imagine considering survival is probably their only goal, really, they're probably going from town to town looking for supplies and perhaps a good place to hold up. It'd be really cool to learn more about that specific lore, like what happens between Highrise and Buried. And perhaps we'll do that for the buried episode of Learning Lore. But for now, I'll catch you guys in the next one. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, consider leaving a like down below. It helps me out a ton, and of course, make sure to subscribe so you can come back for more. I absolutely love this Learning Lore series, and it is teaching me so much that I didn't know. It's really crazy that I didn't, to be honest. There is an insane amount of lore behind these zombies maps, even these first ones, that seemingly the Easter eggs were sort of simple, but even if that's the case, the lore behind them is crazy. And if you did enjoy this and you want to watch more of my content, you can click one of the videos on your screen right now, but if not, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Stay awesome, and peace out.